Hi. I was listening today to an interview, very, very long interview, about 2 or 3 hours it went on YouTube. And it was an interview in Spanish. They were interviewing one of the leading members of the Spanish Geopolitical Institute, something like that. And it was an interview from Argentina, and it went on for a long, long time, but they were asking him about just about everything, the topics that are here today. It was the day when the helicopter, the Iranian president, we didn't know at the time. Okay, we didn't know whether it had been an accident, whether it had been an attempt, whether he was dead or alive. We didn't know, so it was that day. Okay, so they're asking him about his reaction to that. They're asking him about his take on Putin's visit to China. A number of things. It was like a weekly thing of what had been going on that week. This was done, I believe it was the 19th. Okay, so I was listening to it. It was an amazing interview, actually. Very, a lot of info there, a lot of analysis and so on. And the very last, when they had been talking for about 2 hours. And at the very end, the last question, the interviewer says, his name is Ariel Umpierrez. I follow his YouTube videos every day. He speaks for about 2 hours sometimes, and he's very knowledgeable. He is a historian. He's an economist. Fantastic interviews. I learn a lot from him. Insights, So anyway, they had been talking for about 2 hours. And then he says, well, finally, just one last question. We've been talking for a while and about Ukraine. What is your take on what is happening now? Because obviously tomorrow, the 20th of May, that seems to be the end of President Zelensky's mandate. So what is going to happen, and so on, and has Ukraine lost, and if they lost, when did they lose, and how did they lose? It just gives us a sort of a very general, analysis of it. And he said, no, I'm not going to give you an analysis because everyone sort of have been listening to us on this topic for a very, very long time. But I'm going to tell you just very, very quickly. And then he goes on for about 25 minutes. But very, very quickly he says, I'm going to give you a sort of a very summary of a diagnosis, as it were, of what has been happening. I repeat, his name is Juan Antonio Aguilar, and he's a member of the Geopolitical Institute. I should have checked the name of the institution, but anyway, he's a big guy there in geopolitics. Okay, so then he starts by saying, well, it seems as if he's going to just say very quickly in 2 or 3 minutes the diagnostic summary of Ukraine, and he starts, and I sort of wrote it down, sort of kind of semi-translated it, as it were. And the interview says, well, look, Russia is advancing. Now there have been changes in government in Russia. He points all these things out. He said, I ask you also because I have just heard about a day or two ago, says the interviewer, that he's fluent in French because he studied history at the Sorbonne. And he says, I was just listening to one retired French general saying specifically that Ukraine cannot win this war. We have to stop, he says, let us not blindfold ourselves. Ukraine cannot win this war, and he goes on and explains why. It has no more men. The West cannot keep sending any more weapons, and so on. And so he says, how do you react to that? And so this is Juan Antonio Aguilar's reply. He says, Russia has the capacity for industrial production to continue with this war of such high intensity. Russia has been advancing from the very beginning, advancing in all areas. You can say, some have called it the strategy of the 2,000 cuts, or the salami, you start cutting and you end up with nothing. Or anyway, the war of attrition, of wasting away the enemy. Yeah. Their strategies, they advance on the north, then the Ukrainians have to come and protect that. Then they weaken the middle, the center, then they have to go there, then they go to the south, and so on. He says, I don't want to go on for too long explaining this, but as a diagnostic, when sometimes we say or we hear that Ukraine can no longer win this war, I say it never could. Or rather, the question should be, why cannot NATO win this war? But in what affects Ukraine specifically, Ukraine began to lose in 1990 when purposefully ignored the referendum for keeping or maintaining the Soviet Union and got together with a traitor called Boris Yeltsin, who was supported by the US, and another from Belarus, in a forest in Belarus. And the three of them, not four, the three of them signed a dissolution of the Soviet Union. They therefore decided to ignore the popular will of the Soviet people at the time, which through a referendum had expressed the keeping of the nation together by a 76%. Okay, that doesn't mean that everyone was delighted with the Soviet Union, and it could have been that in 5 years' time, if they had another referendum, that would have decreased. But in any case, at that particular time, a referendum was put forward, and 76% of the people wanted to maintain the unity. We know also that Yeltsin was helped, and his campaign helped and financed by the United States. We know that now. Anyway, he says, from then on, anyone can look at indicators, the ratios, economic, social ratios, demographic ratios also, etc., of the Ukraine, and see that from 1990 it began to go down on a downward spiral, sometimes more pronounced than others, but downwards nevertheless. Ukraine lost in 2014 when the US arranged for a coup d'etat and to delegitimize the democratic government. A democratically elected president was expelled, and they imposed, well, they did not impose themselves, but the US, with Victoria Nuland, imposed who had to be the president of Ukraine, something that she said cost $5 billion. Ukraine lost when it launched an operation of genocidal and ethnic cleansing against its own population in the Donbass, which, according to UN sources, led to the death of 15,000 people, their own people in eastern Ukraine, civilians for the most part, and tens of thousands wounded. Tens of thousands also expelled from their homes and from their territories. Ukraine lost when the Minsk agreements, Minsk I and II, were made. The Western powers, however, encouraged it to say no to them. It was a time that they used to buy, as everybody knows, armament to go to war against Russia. Ukraine lost in 2021. That's again before Russia went in. When Russia offered a negotiation, not only to Ukraine but to NATO, wanting to establish a collective security treaty in Europe that would have meant the neutrality of Ukraine and a buffer zone and so on. That would have brought peace to Europe. But of course we know, this is me talking now, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but we do know that the United States does not want Europe and Russia together, because Europe and Russia together can be quite a challenge. They have to be separated. Yeah. So of course they would not. But he's saying that Russia was saying that perhaps a cordon sanitaire buffer zone. Okay. No, that was not accepted. Ukraine lost in 2022. When, after negotiation, an agreement with Russia in Istanbul, which implied, and this has been recognized by Aristovich and other negotiators who were there all the time, that it was practically done. They had initialed it. The bottles of champagne had been opened. This is said by people who were there, because it would have been of a benefit to everyone. But it seems that Ukraine recognized actually that Russia itself had did not have any territorial gains, in the sense he didn't want to conquer Ukraine. They wanted Ukraine's neutrality, and nevertheless this peace agreement became useless because the Western powers did not allow Ukraine to sign it and to go forward with it. Ukraine lost in 2023 when with NATO in command, with NATO weapons, with NATO money, with NATO's advisors, with NATO's intelligence, with NATO's air systems, etc., etc. It launched an offensive in June 6, 2023, and then a week later we knew it would be unsuccessful. But Ukraine had to keep going, had to keep it up until practically the month of October. And that meant more than 100,000 people dead, Ukrainian people. Imagine the number of wounded, and the destruction of weapon systems, materiel, ammunition, which meant all that. What it accomplished was that they managed to advance about 200 square meters on vacant land, in which, in all that vacant land, there was only one tiny village of about 800 people, Robotino, which today is back in Russian hands anyway. Ukraine lost in 2024 because now it appears that from now on there have been no elections, so there is a question as to whether this present government is legitimate. But Ukraine, he says, he continues, has not been democratic since 2014. The TV stations were closed down, political parties banned, the opposition leader jailed, political parties banned, and social leaders. The church, the Orthodox Church, persecuted and plundered. Many of things in churches were sent to the West, to museums and so on. I wondered whether they sold them or gave them away, but anyway, they're gone. There is strict censorship, repression. You cannot complain. There are no elections. So, he says, on the 20th of May, it seems as if there is a question mark about the legitimacy of the president. But obviously he's going to stay there, so we could be talking now about a dictatorship or a dictatorial regime at any case. Ukraine lost when corruption, which has been endemic since 1990, but much more developed now, systematically so. When, for example, the Russian offensive not too long ago in the Kharkov region, they found that they just could walk through the lines because the defenses had not been built. And the defense lines, and they were not built because someone took the money given by the US for this purpose. They actually sent men to fight in those conditions. Someone stole the money, and the Ukraine lost when it decided also on an absolute vassalage to NATO. It lost all sovereignty as a nation, and it is no longer that it depends on NATO. The orders come from NATO. The orders are given by NATO. Ukraine lost precisely because of that attachment to NATO, which decided to fight this war on NATO's military doctrine. Battle of maneuver that has been a disaster and was seen as a disaster as such in that offensive. They did not realize that Russia had imposed a war of attrition, of wasting away the enemy, for which, yes, Russia did have enough individual fabric and sufficient power and sufficient strategic reinforcements, while Ukraine, as has been seen, NATO, even NATO does not have the capacity. Ukraine lost, as we see now, the rate of resupply of war material, which is less than zero. Now, that ratio of less than zero is something that people who have military knowledge at operational level use, less than zero. And that is when they know that at the end you're going to be left with no weapons and without ammunition. Ukraine lost when the replacement rate of soldiers and the fallen is also considered less than zero. That is why the sending of weapons now, many times The military asks, and who is going to handle them? Who is going to operate those weapons? They are running out of reserves. There is no personnel. Ukraine lost when all these variables made the morale of the soldiers sink so low. When Bakhmut became a meat grinder, when the offensive was a catastrophe, when Advieka could not hold, when the front lines flee, morale is very low indeed, and without combat morale there is no possibility of winning. Ukraine lost when the current mobilization effort is seen that it is a failure. People leave, people have left. 100,000 deserters, they're called, and those who left go abroad, and those who have gone abroad will not return. They will not go to fight. Russia has 20,000 volunteers a month. Ukraine lost when, since 1990, and at a much more accelerated pace since 2014, and even at a tremendously more accelerated pace since 2022, it finds itself in an authentic demographic catastrophe. From 53 million inhabitants, is slowly bleeding away. It has lost millions of people. Many of them went to Eastern Europe, to Canada, and to Russia too. And from 2014 lost Crimea and the Donbass. About 11 million inhabitants. The Donbass they could have kept. Even though they wanted to be an autonomous republic, it would have been within Ukraine. So they lost, Crimea and the Donbass, about 11 million inhabitants. And from 2022, 6 million people left. And another 6 million approximately went to Russia. So possibly there will not be left in Ukraine at the moment more than 22 million people. Now, if we take into account children and the elderly and essential personnel for the civil service, necessary services, all paid these services by the US tax dollars anyway. But the maintenance of companies that are strategic, on the structures of the state and so on, and about 1 million people at the front, perhaps not that many, what mobilization capacity do you have left? So, for all these reasons, he continues, the Ukraine lost. It lost the war, and it lost because at any one given moment, everybody makes bad decisions too, or are led to make bad decisions. They are led and they are channeled, and then they are put in one path that ends up in catastrophe. And these for the interest of others, not their own interest. That could have been a mistake. For the interest of others and their benefit. So who won here? Well, some people won. The Biden family won here. The oligarchs won, those people who had become rich by stealing of public properties of the old Soviet state. The Kolomovskis, Poroschenkos, all the same tribe. Who won in Ukraine? The investment funds that are pretending a reconstruction, and they're doing huge business in the West, BlackRock and all those. Why they already have the investment, the money for that, and if they didn't have it, they would take it from the frozen assets of Russia anyway. So they call it reconstruction, and these restoration also plans that will come from the budget of the European Union. That is, it will be the citizens of the European Union that will pay, and their children. They have won. Those are the ones who have won. The rest, they all lost. The Russians who died lost, and the ones who are still dying in the fighting. The Ukrainians lost, dying in the front, and those who had to leave their homes and their way of life, who now abroad have to hide because their passports will no longer be renewed in their embassies, and so they become illegal wherever they are. All of them lost too. Who won? The usual warlords. The American industrial complex, which is going to get, well, he says, from the last 61 billion approved in aid, if you take away 4.8 billion, that probably will go to someone's pocket and their cronies there in the Ukraine. The rest falls back to the industrial military complex, the arm manufacturers, that is, the money paid in taxes by the ordinary American taxpayer will pass directly to the arm manufacturers to make weapons for profit. That is, a transfer from labor to capital, and in between the blood of the Ukrainians. And what I find annoying, he continues, is that many Ukrainians themselves have not yet realized that they have been subjected to this suffocating entity that is sucking their blood for their own power and their own profit and their own interest. There are these information campaigns that leads them to think, without they don't realize it, that they have lost. Not because at this particular moment they're losing this particular battle in Robotyno or whatever it might be. They have lost, they have been losing since 1990. Since 2014, since 2022, and they continue to lose. And that is what the Ukrainian people should come to realize. He says it is lamentable. Those were his words. I think I'm going to leave it there. Perhaps I will share with you some of the things that he says about Russia and China, which was extremely interesting. Very good insights there, but this might be a little bit too long, so I'll leave it here. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.